The lights blazed down on the studio like a spotlight on a battlefield. The crowd was already shouting, signs waving high in the air, some reading Trump forever, others facts matter. The energy was more like a championship fight. Then a political debate. Cameramen moved like soldiers, reporters whispered nervously behind the scenes, and social media feeds lit up as the countdown began. Jessica Hart, the anchor known for handling chaos with grace, stepped forward. Looked directly into the camera and said, "Tonight's debate may shift the future of America's trade policy and, perhaps, more. What you're about to witness is raw, real, and unpredictable." The room fell silent. In one corner stood Michael Steele Lolder. Experienced, confident, he adjusted his tie and placed both hands firmly on the podium. His smile was tight, his eyes cautious. This wasn't his first war. Former RNC chairman and now a leading voice against Trump. He had spent years sharpening his attacks. He believed tonight would be no different. Across from him stood Karoline Leavitt, young and poised, her red MAGA jacket impossible to ignore. She smiled like she knew something the rest of the world didn't. She didn't shift, didn't blink. Her hands rested on the podium like she was already in control. Jessica's voice cut through the tension. "Let's begin with trade policy. Mr. Steele." Steele wasted no time. "Trump's tariff strategy has been a disaster," he said, voice firm. "A 25% tax on imports from Mexico and Canada, and 10% on Chinese goods. It's not protecting jobs. It's hurting small businesses. In Maryland, where I'm from, I've spoken to shop owners barely hanging on. Prices are up 15% on basic goods. Americans are paying more for electronics, clothing, even food." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "A study by the International Economic Institute predicts our GDP will shrink by 0.5% in 2025 if these tariffs continue." This isn't leadership, it's economic suicide. The anti-Trump side of the room erupted in applause. Few MAGA supporters booed, but they waited. They knew what was coming. Karoline Leavitt didn't speak right away. She simply looked at Steele, then at the camera. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was calm but sharp. "Mr. Steele," she said, "you sound like the same globalist. Politicians who sold out American workers for decades." Gasps echoed through the studio. Leavitt straightened her back and continued. "Trump's tariffs are not a failure. They're a weapon used to protect the American dream. Since the tariffs began, domestic manufacturing has grown 15%. Factories in Pennsylvania are hiring again. In Pittsburgh, a steel worker told me, thanks to Trump, I have a job for the first time in 10 years. The MAGA crowd roared. Leavitt wasn't done. She reached below the podium and pulled out a file. It was thick, official looking. She held it up. "You want numbers? Fine. Let's talk reality." Jessica leaned forward. Steele looked confused. "This," Leavitt said, "is a private memo between the Trump administration and EU trade officials. It shows that the tariffs forced the European Union to back down. They agreed to reduce barriers on American steel and medical equipment. This memo proves it's signed, sealed, and dated just 2 weeks ago." Steele blinked. His jaw tightened. Jessica looked stunned. The crowd murmured like a storm building in the distance. "Where did you get that?" Steele asked sharply. Leavitt smiled. "It's called doing your homework, Mr. Steele, something your generation seems to have forgotten." The crowd exploded. Some cheered, others shouted in protest. Jessica held up her hands, trying to restore order. It was no use. Leavitt continued, louder now, pushing through the noise. "Global inflation is projected at 3.8% next year. But under Trump, U.S. inflation is holding at 2.5%. You think that's a coincidence? It's not. These tariffs work. They force China and Europe to negotiate fairer deals. U.S. exports are up 11%. That's not a failure, it's a win." Chants started in the MAGA section, USA. USA. Steele stepped forward, trying to interrupt. This is reckless, but Leavitt didn't stop. Do you want our country dependent on cheap goods from China? Or do you want to rebuild American industry? My father lost his job when his factory moved to Vietnam. I was 15. Don't tell me this isn't personal. That line stopped even the loudest hecklers. For a moment, there was silence. Jessica finally regained control. We'll take a short break, she said, her voice slightly shaky. But don't go anywhere. This debate is just beginning. As the cameras cut, producers rushed the stage. One whispered to Jessica, "We didn't approve that document. Should we cut the feed?" Jessica shook her head. "No, let it roll." Backstage, a reporter from a foreign news outlet whispered into her phone in French, "It's worse than we thought. She has the memo. They're using the debate as a negotiation tactic." Michael Steele stood still, hands gripping the podium. He looked at Karoline like he was seeing her for the first time. She smiled again, calm and unbothered. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was war. The air backstage was tense as producers scrambled, whispering into headsets and frantically checking feeds. The studio lights stayed hot, the audience still buzzing from Karoline Leavitt's reveal. The camera crew was back in place. Jessica Hart walked slowly to center stage again, her eyes scanning both debaters. A producer counted her down. 3, 2, we're back, Jessica said. And the temperature here is rising faster than anyone expected. Miss Leavitt has just revealed a classified trade memo during our live broadcast. Mr. Steele, your response. Michael Steele took a moment before speaking. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid. But he didn't sit down. He leaned in. That memo, he said carefully, proves one thing. Donald Trump negotiates with threats, not diplomacy. Okay, diplomacy. That's not strategy, that's chaos. Pressure like that might win small battles, but it loses wars. Our allies are starting to distrust us. The anti-Trump crowd clapped, but it was weaker than before. Steele wasn't just fighting Leavitt now. He was fighting a shift in the room. Leavitt tilted her head, clearly enjoying herself. You call it chaos. I call it strength, she said. For decades, Washington has bowed to foreign pressure. Trump changed that. He used power, leverage, and courage. You wouldn't understand that, Mr. Steele, because your generation feared headlines more than failure. The audience reacted. Instantly. Murmurs turned to shouts. A man in the front row stood and shouted, "Tell him, Karoline." Jessica raised her hand to quiet the crowd again, but the energy was already out of control. Steele's voice cracked slightly. Let me explain something to you, Miss Leavitt. I've worked with 5 presidents. I've seen what it takes to maintain global order. These tariffs are a ticking time bomb. China is preparing to retaliate. Canada is talking sanctions. And Europe. They're leaking documents like that memo to divide us. Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, leaving her podium entirely. Divide us, she said. Or expose the truth. 'Cause here's the truth. The memo isn't leaked. It was handed to me by an EU trade advisor who believes Trump's plan worked. If I said damned, I quote, he forced us to the table. That quote hit like a gunshot. The cameras caught it, the audience heard it. And somewhere in diplomatic circles, alarms were going off. Jessica leaned forward, now visibly nervous. Miss Leavitt, are you suggesting a European trade official gave you private documents to influence this debate? I'm not suggesting it, Leavitt said coolly. I'm stating it. They're tired of dealing with weak American negotiators. They see strength in Trump. So do I, Steele was shaking his head. You're playing with fire. International. Trade relationships take years to build. You destroy that in a single television moment, and it's not just about factories, it's about alliances. About peace? Leavitt's smile disappeared. Peace. Tell that to the 40,000 Americans who lost jobs while you played diplomat. The MAGA crowd erupted again. A few audience members stood up shouting, pushing back against anti-Trump voices. Security started to move in. Jessica raised her voice. Please, everyone, sit down. We're continuing. But even she sounded unsure. Then something unexpected happened. A live producer handed Jessica a note. Jessica read it, her expression changing instantly. She looked at the camera. We're receiving reports that the EU has just confirmed the authenticity of the memo shown on stage tonight. They're issuing a formal response within the hour. The crowd gasped. Even Steele looked stunned. Leavitt didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Jessica pressed her earpiece deeper. Breaking this just in from Brussels. The memo indicates that a clause in the Trump-EU negotiation allowed emergency reductions in export taxes. If certain performance metrics were met, those metrics were met 2 weeks ago. She looked at Leavitt. Did you know that? I knew. Leavitt said calmly that the numbers don't lie. Steele took a long breath. His hand gripped the side of his podium. Then what you've done tonight, is not just a debate. It's a diplomatic grenade. Leavitt nodded once. Good. It's time Washington stopped hiding behind polite failures. The lights flickered slightly as the control room reset. The tension had shifted again, heavier, deeper. Jessica looked into the camera. What started as a policy debate has now exploded into an international story. We don't yet know the full consequences of what's been said and shown here tonight. But one thing is clear. This is no longer just a political fight. It's a global one. The studio felt colder now. The audience had stopped shouting. Even the MAGA side, energized just minutes ago, had quieted. Something had shifted. The air carried the weight of something irreversible, like a door slammed shut that couldn't be reopened. Michael Steele stood silently, his hands gripping the edges of his podium, knuckles pale. His years in politics taught him how to hide panic. But this wasn't panic, was something deeper. A realization. He wasn't debating a rising star. He was facing a new era that no longer needed him. Jessica Hart, caught between journalism and chaos, spoke carefully into the camera. For those just joining us, tonight's live debate has sparked an international incident. A confidential EU memo confirming the success of Trump-era trade terms has been revealed. We've received confirmation from European officials, and the world is watching. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She stood calmly at the center of the storm she had started. Jessica turned back to Steele. You've accused Trump's tariffs of harming international alliances. But this memo suggests the EU adapted Met targets, shifted exports, and avoided penalties. Isn't that success? Steele's voice was low. Success through fear is still failure. You don't burn bridges and call it construction. You don't bully your friends and call it negotiation. Karoline interrupted. You don't beg your enemies and call it diplomacy. Jessica tried to intervene, but Steele's temper finally cracked. You think you're the future? He snapped. You're just a child in a red jacket reading cue cards written by men who never fought a real trade war. The crowd gasped. Karoline's smile vanished. For a moment, the silence hurt more than the words. Then she spoke. I wrote every word I said tonight. And unlike you, Mr. Steele, I didn't spend 30 years watching this country get ripped off. While pretending to be measured, you sat on panels. I sat with laid-off workers. You gave speeches. I gave them hope. She stepped closer to him. Her voice dropped to a quiet intensity. You want to talk about real? A factory worker named Don called into my campaign office last week. He said your leadership helped outsource his job to Vietnam. Did you smiled while Maryland lost half its manufacturing base? So don't tell me about real. Jessica's voice trembled slightly. We need to keep this civil. But it was too late. A loud voice from the crowd shouted, You sold us out, Steele. Another followed, Leavitt speaks truth. Security moved in again, this time faster. The front row MAGA and anti-Trump attendees were nearly face to face. One of the producers whispered urgently into Jessica's earpiece, "We're getting pulled internationally. BBC wants a live segment." Al Jazeera's already clipping soundbites. Steele leaned forward, trying to steady himself. "You've made a circus of policy, Miss Leavitt. You've made enemies of allies. And for what?" Cloud applause. She didn't blink. For accountability, for strength. And because no one else had the guts to say it out loud. Jessica looked visibly shaken now. "We're cutting to a short break." But before they could, another wave of news hit. A CNN correspondent reported live from Washington. Breaking, Senate aides have confirmed that following tonight's leak, the White House has convened a late-night emergency trade review. Multiple agencies are involved, including the Department of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative's office. The screen split briefly to show Capitol Hill under flashing lights and reporters swarming outside. Back in the studio, Steele's face fell. This wasn't just an embarrassing debate. Lawsuit was policy-level fallout. Government was reacting. In real time, Jessica turned slowly toward Leavitt. "Did you anticipate this?" The federal response. Karoline's voice was quiet but certain. "I expected resistance. I didn't expect silence." This proves they knew something. And they were afraid I'd say it first. Michael Steele took one long breath, then reached for his water glass. His hand shook slightly. "You're tearing down 30 years of diplomacy." Karoline leaned into the mic, her voice firm. "I'm tearing down 30 years of excuses." The screen behind them flashed live coverage of protests in front of the U.S. Embassy in Brussels. Small but passionate crowds were gathering, waving American and EU flags. Chants echoed, "Fair trade now and truth wins." The war Leavitt had started wasn't just in the studio anymore. It was spreading. Jessica Hart stood frozen, mic in hand. The entire segment had spiraled out of her control. This was no longer a debate. It was a political wildfire. And Karoline Leavitt was the match. Michael Steele, now visibly rattled, looked toward the camera. "America will regret this moment." Karoline looked toward the same lens, her expression. "Steele, no. America will remember it." Its countdown to commercial began. But the world wasn't going to take a break. "Not anymore," ChatGPT said. The broadcast returned from commercial, but nothing felt the same. The studio lights still glowed. The crowd still sat divided, and Jessica Hart still stood center stage, mic in hand, but a line had been crossed. Everyone watching knew it. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. Karoline Leavitt stood taller than ever, her red jacket sharp under the lights, like a general in the middle of battle. Across from her, Michael Steele was quieter. Now, his breathing heavier, his confidence shaken. But something else burned behind his eyes, something personal. He wasn't done. Jessica took a breath. For those just joining us, what began as a debate on Trump's tariffs has escalated into a political firestorm. Confidential documents, federal response, protests overseas. And now? A nation on edge. She looked toward Steele. "Mr. Steele, do you want to respond to Ms. Leavitt's claims?" He stepped forward slowly, his voice calm, but colder. "I've served this country longer than she's been alive. I've advised presidents, sat across from world leaders. And yes, I've made compromises. Okay? Because compromise is the only way to lead a country of 330 million people." He turned to Karoline. "You think strength is yelling louder? I think strength is knowing when to listen." Karoline narrowed her eyes. "You didn't compromise, Mr. Steele. You caved." The crowd stirred. She continued, her voice steady. "You didn't fight when trade deals gutted the Midwest. You didn't fight when China flooded our markets with cheap steel. You didn't fight for Baltimore or Detroit or Allentown. You just sat there. And now you're mad because I stood up." Steele slammed his hand on the podium. You're twisting history. Trump didn't rebuild America. He isolated it. You call tariffs a weapon? I call them a time bomb. Karoline didn't flinch. And I say better a time bomb than a slow bleed. Jessica tried to speak, but suddenly a new alert flashed on the studio monitor behind them. A producer shouted, "We have breaking footage live from Brussels." The crowd gasped. A giant screen lit up the studio outside the U.S. Embassy. A European trade official was giving a press conference. His voice was firm, his English clear. We were surprised by the release of private trade documents during tonight's American broadcast. However, I confirm that the data shown was accurate. The EU has adjusted to the tariffs. Negotiations were intense, but fair. We do not consider these terms hostile, only difficult. Steele looked stunned. Jessica turned to him. That sounds like validation. He said nothing. Karoline broke the silence. They adapted because we stopped begging. They respected us when we stopped apologizing. The crowd roared. The MAGA side was on its feet, chanting again. Even some of the independents seemed unsure now, shifting in their seats. Jessica's earpiece buzzed. Say it, the producer urged. She turned back to the camera. We've just received a second confirmation from inside the U.S. Trade Representative's office. They've launched a classified review of all active global trade contracts. The leak has triggered a government response larger than expected. Michael Steele blinked slowly. His voice lowered. You have no idea what you've started. Karoline's eyes didn't waver. You're right, I don't know where this ends. But I know where it started. It started with men like you who talked big and did little. Who smiled while our economy bled. She leaned into the mic. And if this chaos is what it takes to wake people up, I'll take the blame. Jessica was about to speak when something unexpected happened. Steele turned away from Karoline, away from the crowd, looked into the camera directly. His voice dropped to something raw. You want truth? Fine. When I was RNC chair, we did nothing when thousands of small factories closed. I watched workers lose everything. And we told them, it's just globalization. We lied. Room went silent. He continued. I sat in those rooms. We thought sacrificing 10,000 jobs to gain influence in Brussels was smart politics. Maybe it was, but it wasn't moral. We were wrong. Jessica's jaw dropped. Karoline froze. The audience didn't cheer, they just stared. It's Michael Steele's side. But here's the difference, Ms. Leavitt. I admit it. I face it. You just weaponize it. Then he stepped back. Karoline didn't speak. For the first time that night. She seemed unsure whether to respond. Jessica looked back and forth between them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no longer a debate. This is history unfolding. Tonight, two voices stood before the nation, one representing tradition, the other rebellion. And both just exposed truths that may change everything. It's the show. Cut to an emergency news update. But in the studio, the war wasn't over. It had only paused for breath. The screen faded to black for only a second. When the broadcast returned, something had changed, not in the lighting, not in the stage design, but in the air itself. The tension was no longer just political, was personal, deep, raw. The crowd had gone quiet. Even the MAGA side stopped chanting. No one knew what would happen next. Jessica Hart stood frozen for a beat. Then she stepped forward slowly, her voice controlled. We are entering uncharted territory. Michael Steele just confessed to political decisions that shaped the collapse of thousands of American jobs. Karoline Leavitt exposed classified trade deals. And now, the entire U.S. trade policy is under review. Let's continue if we still can. Karoline's expression had shifted. No longer fiery, now calculated. She leaned into her mic. Mr. Steele, thank you for your honesty. But here's the part you left out. You didn't just sit by and watch. You signed off on it. And now? You want credit for confession? Like that makes you brave? Steele's eyes narrowed. She pressed on. The working class in this country doesn't need apologies. They need leadership. They need someone who fights like hell before it's too late. Jessica looked between them. Let's move to foreign policy. But Karoline didn't stop. No. Let's talk about what really happened in 2017. The air cracked. Steele shifted. I don't know what you're referring to. Karoline reached into her jacket. The camera zoomed in on her hand, pulling out a small folder. Red stamped. Confidential. She slid it across her podium like a poker player revealing her final card. The Steele Kobayashi memo. She said. Jessica's voice dropped. That file was sealed. Karoline nodded. Until now. The studio plunged into stunned silence. Michael Steele's hands gripped the podium. You're playing with national security. Karoline was calm. You played with it first. Jessica read quickly from the exposed document. This memo, if real, shows a covert trade summit in Tokyo. You advised then-Senator Kobayashi to delay reindustrialization efforts in the Rust Belt, to keep Japanese relations stable. Steele didn't answer. Jessica looked horrified. You buried Ohio and Pennsylvania manufacturing to protect foreign deals. Steele stepped back from the podium, visibly shaken. You don't understand international diplomacy. There were reasons. Karoline raised her voice. No more reasons, just results. You picked Tokyo over Toledo. The crowd stirred again. Murmurs of shock rippled like electricity. Phones lit up across the studio. This wasn't a TV show anymore, which is a national event. Steele, now pale, tried to hold ground. That memo. Was context not policy? We were navigating fallout from the G7 exit. Trump's team wanted to pull us from half the trade treaties on Earth. Karoline didn't budge. And that's why we should have pulled out. Jessica looked into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now confirmed the authenticity of the Steele Kobayashi memo. Multiple outlets are reporting simultaneous coverage. The White House has issued a brief response calling the matter under review. Steele took a slow breath. You have no idea how much damage you've done? Karoline's voice cut through. Then let me show you how much damage. You did. She tapped a button on her podium. A pre-recorded video began to play on the studio screen. A Rust Belt factory worker? Eyes sunken, explaining how his job was outsourced 2 months after that Tokyo summit. His wife had left. His health insurance collapsed. He blamed Washington. He blamed politicians who shook hands with foreign leaders and forgot their own people. As the video ended, Karoline whispered into her mic, "That's your legacy." Steele didn't respond. He couldn't. Jessica's voice wavered. Michael, do you want to say anything? The former RNC chair stood silent, his image flickering on monitors across the country. For a full 5 seconds, America watched him. Say nothing, Then he spoke quietly. I did what I thought was best for the country. I didn't know how much it would cost. Jessica turned to the camera. Tonight, we didn't just hear a political debate. We watched the unraveling of a chapter in American trade policy. Leavitt revealed documents the public was never meant to see. Steele confessed to compromises that shattered families. The camera zoomed slowly, and with just 2 episodes left in this broadcast, one thing is certain. She paused. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The silence after Michael Steele's last words didn't last long. Within seconds, the studio filled with the buzz of breaking news alerts. Every phone in the audience lit up. Media outlets from across the globe were picking up the story. The leaked memo, the confession, the collapse of decades of political alliances. And at the center of it, all Karoline Leavitt, a 20-something former press secretary, now the face of a new political storm. Jessica Hart, sensing the shift, stepped in with a rare tremble in her voice. We're receiving word that the Senate Finance Committee is convening an emergency session. The president is expected to address the nation in the next 24 hours. Michael Steele remained still, one hand gripping the edge of the podium. His legacy, carefully built over decades, was burning live. Karoline's voice sliced through the noise. You asked earlier if I understood diplomacy. Let me answer that. Diplomacy is not about smiling with foreign powers while your own people are begging for help. It's about priorities. And America hasn't been one of yours for a long time. She stepped forward, said the G7 crisis forced your hand. But we now know, thanks to that memo you made deals behind. Closed doors with foreign lobbyists and allowed the industrial Midwest to collapse in exchange for a few trade privileges. Steele finally turned to her, voice low but firm. You don't know what it's like to carry the burden of holding this country together during chaos. Karoline didn't blink. You're right, but I do know what it's like to fight for it when no one else will. The crowd erupted in cheers, then boos, then a mix of both. The room was divided again, but not like before. Now the line wasn't between left and right. It was between the old guard and the new fire. Jessica raised her hand, attempting to regain control. Let's bring this back. We still have 2 more segments. Karoline, I'm told you've brought additional documentation. Karoline nodded. Yes, a second memo. One that never reached the press. She held up another folder. Blue, labeled EU-US Strategic Trade Reset. Proposal -2020. The camera zoomed in on the label, and for a moment, no one said a word. This, Karoline said, is the proposal Steele helped author that would have given the European Union control over American agricultural exports? It would have let foreign regulators set our standards for meat and dairy products in exchange for investment credits that never came. Jessica took a moment. That proposal was rejected by the White House. It never became policy. Karoline smiled slightly. Exactly. Trump shut it down, but Steele supported it. Steele's voice cracked. That's because I believed in compromise. Karoline didn't move, and Trump believed in sovereignty. The audience was restless. The MAGA supporters were now chanting again, but lower, more rhythmic. On the other side, viewers looked stunned, as if watching a piece of history fall. Apart in real time, Jessica glanced at her earpiece. We've just been informed that protests are forming outside the Capitol, both for and against what's being revealed tonight. The footage is being streamed live. We are now the #1 global trend on social media. Karoline turned to the camera. Her voice softened. This isn't about me, or even about Steele. This is about what kind of country we're becoming. Are we going to keep hiding truths in locked drawers and pretending politics is a private club? Or are we going to demand answers even if they make us uncomfortable? Jessica whispered, You're turning this into a revolution. Karoline looked at her. No, I'm just finishing what others were too afraid to start. Suddenly, a shout came from the audience. Then another. Security moved in fast, blocking a protester from storming the stage. Jessica called for calm. The screen split for a moment, one half showing the debate, the other half broadcasting live footage from Washington, D.C. police. Sirens, marches. Michael Steele closed his eyes, perhaps realizing he was no longer in control, not of the stage, the story, or his legacy. Karoline leaned into her mic one more time. Mr. Steele, you spent your life trying to protect an establishment that left millions behind. You had your chance. Now it's our turn. The camera zoomed in as Steele finally opened his eyes. But this time, they were different, distant, haunted. Jessica looked into the lens. Tonight, we are watching the collapse of an era. A war of ideologies, trade secrets, and political power. And next comes the fallout. The screen dimmed. The nation held its breath. The next morning, the world looked different. Cable news ran Karoline Leavitt's face on a loop. Her words were quoted by politicians, debated by scholars, and dissected by anchors who had ignored her just weeks before. Michael Steele's name, once associated with respect and command in conservative circles, now trended with hashtags like #Steele collapse and #legacy shattered. Outside the Capitol, thousands gathered, chanting, waving flags, holding signs that read, "No more deals. In the darkened trade, truth matters." It wasn't just a political controversy, it was a rupture. One that exposed how deeply Americans had grown tired of shadow diplomacy, globalist trade deals, and political figures playing both sides. Karoline Leavitt sat in a temporary green room near Capitol Hill, the aftermath unfolding around her. She stared at her phone, watching the live feed of protests in New York, Los Angeles, and even London. She wasn't celebrating. Not yet. She knew what was coming. A knock on the door. Jessica Hart entered, her usual calm replaced by visible tension. "They're calling it the debate that cracked the system. You're being asked to testify. Both the House and Senate want you in front of the cameras again." Karoline stood slowly, voice low. "Let them call. I'm not done." Jessica hesitated. "There's more." Karoline nodded and walked over to a red folder on the table. The first two memos were public damage. This is the fuse. She opened the folder carefully. Inside, evidence of a covert task force authorized in 2019 by bipartisan lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats alike, to build a backdoor data sharing agreement with EU tech giants in exchange for surveillance access across U.S. manufacturing zones. The purpose? To track labor strikes and economic disruptions. Jessica took a step back. That would take down half the Hill. Karoline stared at the papers. "Good, then maybe we can rebuild something honest." Meanwhile, inside a private estate in Maryland, Michael Steele sat alone in a dark study. No aides, no calls, just silence. He watched the same news feed, though he already knew how this story would be written. He whispered to himself, "I should have walked away years ago." His phone buzzed. One final message from a former donor. "We needed a leader, not a memory." He didn't reply. By noon, Karoline was standing in front of the Oversight Committee. This time, not as a debater, but as a witness. Cameras rolled, lawmakers shuffled papers nervously. She took her oath, and the room quieted. "In your words, Ms. Leavitt," one senator asked, "what exactly happened that night on live television?" She leaned forward. The truth escaped. And it didn't ask for permission. The room remained still. Back on television, the nation watched every channel, every feed. Karoline continued. "For too long, we've accepted silence as professionalism, backroom deals as compromise. But the American people are not pawns in some global negotiation. They are the reason for every decision we make." One of the senators raised an eyebrow. "Are you accusing members of this chamber of selling out American sovereignty?" She didn't flinch. "I'm not accusing. I'm proving it." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, Karoline walked out of the building into a sea of flashing cameras. A journalist shouted, "Do you think this is the beginning of a new political era?" She paused, looked around at the restless crowd, and smiled faintly. "No," she said. "I think the old one just ended." And with that, she disappeared into the crowd while behind her. The storm continued to rage on homes across the country. Families sat together watching a young woman ignite a fire that Washington thought would never reach its doorstep. They were wrong. The war had come home, and the new generation was just getting started.